pick up where we left off. I was working on these two paintings during our last session. I did a little bit more, not a lot, but I did a little bit more. So we're going to spend another 20 minutes. I think that it's smart to do these smaller, sort of biting off smaller steps. So both paintings that I started the last time, what I did since that video closed, I just went in and I enhanced what I had already started. I went back and enhanced the shadows and started suggesting some of the variation in the light and the dark. I started to clarify what is going to be the middle ground from what will be this foreground. I clarified where that pot's going to be, and then I'll bury it again under leaves, and I set in some dark foundation for that foreground ground plane. This one very similar. I established more clearly that there's a pond, that there's two banks, that there's a back tree line, and that there's a front. There's dark shadows on what are going to be tree lines, and I just went through and just sort of put a second coat because the sky had been so thin that the ground, the yellow ochre, the yellow ground that was under it was making the sky color a little bit too green. Okay, so now we've got these two. I'm going to do a little bit on each, and these would be those steps where you're problem solving and thinking as you keep working. So this one, got that photo. You can think how gardens feel. So when I'm painting this, I'm trying really hard to not 100% be slavish to the photo. I'm trying to think of how, the irises that are out in one of my garden beds. I'm trying to think of how, when I walk through different gardens, I see all of these layers. So I'm gonna work again from back to front, and at this point I'm gonna try to stick to that as I keep working on the painting. So I just lifted a little bit of the green gold, and I just grabbed some Jenkins green. Okay, Jenkins green I don't even think is on your list as an optional color. It's another historic color, meaning it's an old traditional color. I keep it on my palette if I'm working with a lot of to get that effect. I could have done primary cyan, the primary blue, and probably just a very, very small touch of either alizarin crimson or the transparent quinacridone, the burnt orange with the quin at the beginning. So I just mixed a slightly darker, but it's not as, so it's a slightly desaturated or grayed down green, and I'm going to just begin to build a little bit of texture, a little bit of variety within those shadows themselves. And since I know that what I'm seeing, the light is catching where the different branches are sticking out from that mass of hedge, and where they stick out, they catch some more light. And they're sticking out within shadow, they're sticking out farther and catching brighter highlights. So I'm going to just, I'm looking at the picture, and it helps me see, sometimes you can tell there's a whole tumbling area. Sometimes they seem to be branches that are big enough that their gesture is going up. I kept that paint fairly opaque. It has just a little bit of medium that I dipped in, but I don't need this to be transparent. And I'm just taking that through. By the way, there are people putting a new roof on today, so if you hear this pounding, it's not that I'm in a battle zone, it's simply that it's this non-stop staple gun pounding thing all day. So I'm going to work through that, and I would do this through the whole thing. For the sake of this being a process, I'm not going to, a process video to sort of help instruct you, I'm not going to do the whole thing right now. I'll go back and work on it before our next video, but right now I'm just enhance what would be the layers of this edge where some of the sky is showing through. Remember, I added that. I made a subjective choice based on what I think is going to make this composition a little more spatially rich. So I would, since this is that intermediate, I'm just using it to create a little more variety in what would be that break between so much growth. Okay, so, and I'd work through that whole thing. Now I'm going to move forward, and if I move forward just to the very back, I see, and I'm grabbing some of the primary cyan, the blue, a little bit of glazing liquid. So that's like really, really yucky plastic looking blue, but it is a cool blue-green, because I see in the very background in the shadows, it is a blue-green. Added just a little tiny bit of ink to cut that so it feels a bit more organic. And I'm going to go to the back there. And now remember, I would have worked that first thing I was doing the whole way down. So now I'm going to come towards the bottom, and I see that in the very back there's a variety of different, and I should be able to identify, but I can't. I'm going to put a couple vertical lines through there. They seem to just be clustered in this one little area. They're showing up and they create a nice graphic quality. So I'm just going to put some of those stems that have the somewhat even downward facing. So I just work some of those in there, and then I see in the very back there's a variety of some lower plants that are showing up behind everything, and they're very, very blue-green. So I'm just going to work those in. And when I get over to the, so I'm going to take a lot of black into that and make a very almost black-green, because I see in this area I'm going to need a little bit more of that black than I currently have when I start building. So all I'm doing is just introducing some more black that I'm going to paint over. That strong black green will create the dense shadows that are way in the back. You see there's a little area in here where those shadows come down low again. So you see back here there's actually one area where I can see the front bed in front of that hedge, and since I already have the color on my brush, I'm going to lift some green gold, a little bit of primary yellow, and I'm just going to pull some color across there that's going to become that much more that back middle ground where I can see some brighter yellow-green plants in that bed. And a lot of it's going to get lost, but I can see a little bit of it that'll peek behind some of the plants. Okay, so now I've brought that to a new level. I'm going to dig in here and look through brushes and pick a different, again, I like my scripts, so I keep grabbing scripts. This small of a painting, I use a lot of them, especially the nature of this subject. So I had that middle green gold made. I'm looking at what's in the back there, and it's cool. So I'm dipping into the teal. It was an optional color. Teal is a very light, cool blue. I'm getting a color that is pretty bright, and all I'm going to do is just spark through back here, because I can see that I'm going to be building a lot of plants on these fairly tall stems that show up pretty graphically. So I'm going to just again, I try not to be too graphic or too orderly. I'm not a Audubon painter. I'm not trying to capture these very specific plants. I don't need to do plant IDs. And there are really cool, there are actually Audubon painter workshops. So if that's something that you really like, that idea of gardens in that level of accuracy, there are artists who work that way. Okay, so all I'm going to do is just keep adding some, because I see a variety of different plant forms that are going to be riding on these different stems that are sticking up. And that next level is just loaded with all of these different. This is where I do my usual smash the brush. If you don't like destroying a brush, then don't do that. I get all those different, and all I'm doing is just beginning to suggest what will eventually be all of that kind of twisted tangle of plants that are in there. Okay, so I'm going to bring that across. And then I see some that are more organic, that lean warmer. So I'm going to pick up Dairy Lied Yellow, which I said is a really, really warm orange yellow, or orange yellow, and I want a very, very warm green. I could have also simply gotten that by using the green gold and some of the primary yellow. I just already had a color on my palette that I knew I could just warm up by adding that optional. Dairy Lied Yellow would be if you had a cadmium yellow medium, perhaps a cadmium yellow dark even. So now I'm just going to introduce, because I'm looking at that and I see what are really clearly some much more yellow green stems that are showing up in there. And so I'm going to put some of those in. Notice I'm going right down through where that front plane will be, because I know I can paint over something, and since I'm following that back to front rule, then I know that I will be able to get that effect. Now, because I'm looking up and I see these darks, all I did is I just took my brush load of that light yellow green, and I just went and I lifted some of that dark green that I had used up here. It was still on my palette, because I see now a variety of grasses that are coming through there. They're actually darker. So on this side particularly, a lot of dark grasses are showing up. So I ended up with this sort of middle level of green. Painting is problem solving. It's trying to figure out how to visually interpret and communicate something that either you're experiencing with your eyes, or if we were working more abstractly, something that is a concept you're thinking about either with your imagination or your emotion. So at this point we're still working from observation, so I just work some of those grasses in. I see a lot of that in here. So right over top of some of those lights that I made, I'm just going to introduce what would be grasses that are sort of tumbling up behind these big, beautiful iris leaves that are going to end up painting over some of that. And I'm looking at that color, and that color looks like it's almost perfect for this. Way in the background, there's just a variety of, so I'm just sort of scumbling or pushing my brush and using the side of it just to get a little bit of a texture back there, and since there's medium on my brush, it is semi-transparent on top of everything else. So I keep going, and I work that through because I see a variety of, I see these greens that are back here, and I'm not trying to paint every plant I see, but if I notice that suddenly there's larger, more pronounced petals, then I might just introduce some brush work that suggests that, because one of the things that always catches your eye and creates interest is any kind of variety. And I see as I get over here, there's all of a sudden some lighter. And once again, I'm not a Audubon naturalist, so I'm not trying to recreate what might be very specific, not might be, what were very specific plants. Instead, I'm going to just use this variety of greens to my advantage. I see some of them are showing up over here between these plants. And then I'm going to lift some primary yellow and mix it in there. It's way on this right-hand side. There's a whole lot of some kind of a different texture, and I'd already put some of that in the back. Down in here, I'm going to just bounce some of this through, because behind those big leaves of that iris, there's going to be some of that lighter color show. So now I would keep working down through there, and I'm going to keep my promise and make this just a faster. I would keep working through those greens. I'm going to do 1 or 2 leaves on the iris just to show you what I would do. I'm just reached into that teal, that really, really, really blue green, because there's a lot of very strong blue greens in that. So since I have that on my brush, I put a tiny bit of ink in there, and to show what I would start doing. So I see some of these leaves are really bluish green. So I would be working those in. And take note, I'm trying to pull my brush in a stroke from the origin up to the end of the leaf that conveys that energy. So I'm not going to keep doing all of those. Dipped into another optional color, Prussian blue, which is a darker blue. Some of these are distinctly darker. Just to show, I would also I'd be working through that whole thing. And in the back, they are very beautiful light yellow greens. So I'm going to make a nice taupe green gold, a little bit of primary yellow, add a tiny bit of white to that because I want it to jump. It's pretty bright. I'm going to add a little bit more yellow to it because when I look, it is distinct. And all of these, the back especially, is where you're catching some of these beautiful, much higher contrast yellow greens. And normally I would do everything from the back to the front, because again, these leaves that are in the very front, I'm going to want to overlap what's in the very back. And there's not a ton of those really brilliantly yellow-green. So when I would work the ones that I see in, or at least the ones I initially see, I could just keep changing. So I just went right over that bluish green, and since I had a brush that had some of the other, it's going to be different than the ones that I had just painted. You can start to see if I'm doing this and I'm being attentive, I'm going to start to convey that complexity of all of these leaves that are starting down and then reaching up in a variety of warm and cool blue green. So I didn't get to the other painting, but I would keep working through this one. Haven't gotten to those flower forms or anything. I would work down through this whole composition thinking of the greens and working those in. When we come back, we'll talk about the flowers on this. We'll talk about that other painting.